Good morning.
Chairwoman Clark, we're ready if you would like to get started.
Perfect. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I apologize for having to be on the phone, but so glad to have this meeting happening, and everyone that is there on the phone or in person, I appreciate you being here. We're going to go to call to order and roll call.
Okay. Chairwoman Clark.
Here.
Vice Chair Foley. Member Burke. Member Canto. Member Castro.
Here.
Member Cruz.
Here.
Member Girondo.
Here.
Member Hamilton. Member Hart.
Here.
Member McMillie.
Here.
Member Yanez.
Here.
Member Reff. Member Vickman.
Here.
And Member Wellborn. You have a quorum. So
Excellent. Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Chairwoman Clark, I just want to let you know for those on the phone, we're sitting at 8 members, which is just a quorum. So if anyone has to drop off the line, you will have to let us know, because then we'll have to end the meeting.
Got it. Is everybody clear on that? Thank you. We'll move to call to the public.
Chairwoman Clark, members of the committee, no call to the public were received.
Thank you. Then we're going to move to item number 2 on the agenda, the presentation and discussion of draft statutory changes.
Chairwoman Clark, members of the committee, we provided to the committee members a draft on statutory changes in regard to the recommendations that went before the board at the December 2018 meeting that the board did approve. As you recall, those recommendations were created by this committee, and Deputy Director Baden has taken those recommendations, sketched out which recommendations should be statutory changes, which recommendations could be rule changes or just practice changes. So we do have Mr. Baden here for the next 20 minutes until he goes to his next meeting. So he will lead us through this statutory draft.
Madam Chair and members, as Alicia said, it's been a while since I've been here, so good to see everyone again. And I am Ketcher Baden. I am Deputy Director here, and one of my many tasks is as the legislative liaison for the State Board of Ed, and in turn for this committee's recommendations and statutory changes. So before you, that was distributed, is a hard copy, and then we also have displayed up on the screen for those who are in the room or watching on YouTube, if we're able to get that up. We also have the electronic version. This, I guess I want to emphasize first, I'll run through it briefly. I just want to emphasize this is a draft. This is literally the first, and I probably drafted it during a late night at the legislature, so just being kind with me as we go through it. And I don't want folks to get nailed down to any language here, or there will be plenty of time to wordsmith it, and we can do that behind the scenes. But as Alicia mentioned, we're trying to capture the broad strokes of the recommendations. As a guide, both for myself and also for those reading, the Ad Hoc Committee Recommendations are more or less listed at the top, numbers 1 through 8. Now, I know there was a lot of thought and effort put into how those were worded in the actual report. These 8 listed here aren't being distributed publicly other than at this meeting right now. This is really just to help us sort of synthesize and start putting it in a draft form. They also don't correspond neatly, so number 1 isn't necessarily the first recommendation. I think it is the first recommendation on the report, but as we go down, they start getting a little mixed and mashed up, so keep that in mind. The other thing I want to keep you in mind, the hard copy, I made a cardinal sin when drafting. I did not put line numbers or page numbers, so when we run through here, I put it on the electronic version, but not on the hard copy, so we'll just have to use section numbers and paragraph and subsections to help guide us. Also, when drafting, I think Senate Bill 1318 at this point when I first drafted it looked like it was going through and probably signed. So what I did was I incorporated that legislation and what I think is most other of the legislation that was signed into this draft. So Senate Bill 1318 you'll get more information on in August, but anything that was added as part of that bill, which was around dyslexia and dyslexia screening, is shown in all caps, just in black. The lowercase black is existing statute that had been in there before this legislative session, and then the recommendations that came out of this committee are shown in color. So stricken red means the committee is recommending taking it out, and big blue, which I'll find somewhere, is recommendations of the committee putting it in. So I'll run through this very briefly. On the first page, the only change that is recommended from the committee that was incorporated in this first draft is seen on the first page, and that's in subsection D in 15-211. And this section of statute deals mostly with the K-3 reading program. That's not specific. Mower statutes are sort of scattered in at least 3 different sections. This is the first, and they're in order of earliest section, and the higher sections are later. So it's not a priority here. It's just how they show up in the statute. Subsection D is a subsection that requires plans, reading plans, and that's what we call literacy plans. They're actually not called literacy plans in statute, but we call them literacy plans. And the language that's stricken at the end of subsection D is this exception that was provided for A and B districts and charters. And this hits back to the recommendation of the committee, which on this page is number 4, and on the actual report is under issue 1 and scattered somewhere in there. That's a pretty straightforward change. Committee wanted all LEAs to submit those every year, regardless of their letter grade, in order to ensure we have data every year that's complete and statewide. Pretty straightforward. We can talk about the politics of how we'll get some of this stuff passed later, but let's just get through the draft and the recommendations now. So that's the only recommended change for 15-11. The rest of this section has the rest to do with the K-3 reading program, including some of the things that the board is charged with. And we can run through, if you'd like, we can review those statutes in more detail later, but because I'm a little short on time, we will run to the next section, which is 15-701. This is the minimum course of study requirements for common schools, which are elementary schools. Common schools is sort of a holdover from our early days as a state, but common schools is elementary. And this is the second part of where those move on when reading statutes are scattered. The first change in this section is subsection A, paragraph 2, item B. Oh, I haven't looked at my bill drafting manual in a while, so I should know. And then little I, little 1. So basically what we're looking at here is these are requirements for the board, and these are A to A are our third grade reading retention. And then once we get to B, we start listing out exemptions for those retention requirements. And then we have our English learners, our SPED folks, and then some of the summer school and other exemptions. Part of the recommendation of the committee was around ELs and to make that exemption to 3 years. So we have a 2 here, stricken out, making it 3, pretty straightforward. Moving on, we have the other exemptions. Some of the other intervention requirements. The next change is picked up in paragraph 3. And if you go back, these are now just listing requirements for the board again. So the lead into this subsection was the board shall. And the original language, this is where the first couple changes were pretty straightforward and easy to find in the statute. This is where we had to start getting a little creative. And these are the ad hoc committee recommendations that are listed as number 1 and 2. And these are essentially what we were talking about as comprehensive assessment systems in the early grades. So to find a way and a place to make that work, we essentially co-opted this existing paragraph, which requires the board to provide for universal screening of pupils in preschool and K-3 to identify if they have reading deficiencies. Now, that doesn't require a statewide universal screener, just provide for universal screening. So we co-opted this paragraph to turn it into our vision of a comprehensive assessment system. So we call it a comprehensive assessment system, and then we list out what that should include. And that is a statewide universal screener, and the statewide intent, the intent of including statewide there is to signify that we want it to be one single statewide universal screener that everybody is using. We put some language in here on when that needs to be administered. That's partially pulled from what is already existing practice for the universal screener. Then we have another part of this assessment system, which is statewide benchmark tool in grade 2. Again, that goes back to the committee's recommendation. And then C, we added, and part of this was when we were looking at the move on when reading and the entire, Sean did a good job of explaining what these assessments are and what their purposes are. And we wanted to ensure that we included what LEAs are doing on their own that isn't necessarily, the statewide mandate. And so that is the inclusion of formative and other assessments as determined by the LEA. That's not something that would be statewide or statewide mandated of what those assessments would be. We're just recognizing that we want them to do other things when we recognize that they are doing other assessments and checks on those students. That's the bulk of the new language. And then the last thing that I want to point out is we jump to the very end here. And we have some session law language at the very last page. And session law language is essentially not language that it still has the force of law, but it's not in there forever and always enshrined in a section of statute. And this is the appropriation for ADE's mower team. Now, frankly, when we go through the process of this will probably be introduced as part of the bill because we see this as a whole package of recommendations, but it'll end up being a budget discussion. So this will probably end up getting stripped out at some point, but wanted to include it here because it was part of the recommendations. And also, I wanted to include it here because we might need to discuss if the language here is pretty squishy, and that might be to ADE's liking, but want to ensure that they have the language needed to do what they need to do to be in line with the ad hoc's recommendations. And then, of course, the number, I know we talked a little bit in this committee, talked a little bit about what other states are doing and what their funding numbers are at. That wasn't actually specifically in the recommendations from the first report. So rather than take a guess at it ourselves, we just kind of left it blank for now. A couple other things, and then I'll open it up for questions briefly. One is that if we are going, and we should probably at some point have a discussion about if we are doing a comprehensive statewide assessment system in the early grades, we should talk about funding for that at some point, how that's being funded and what the cost may be, because that would also be in the ask. And then the other thing that I want to hit back up on when we go to the very top of this document and as to the ad hoc committee's recommendations, what's highlighted in green is what's incorporated into this draft. The non-highlighted items, numbers 3, 5, and 8, are not in here. Part of that is because this was just a decision staff made. We didn't feel that these necessarily needed to be in statute, and we felt that we could do some of these either through board rule or through policy. However, there may be a comfort level with putting them into statute. So there was a recommendation for our third grade statewide assessment to include a dedicated reading assessment portion of that rather than having ELA and pulling out the reading scores. That's something when we're building our statewide assessment system, we could just include. It doesn't have to be in the statute, but it may be something that the ad hoc committee wants to enshrine there. Number 5, this was an issue about not retaining students more than once in the 3rd grade as a result of their below reading levels. I was talking to Sean a little bit about this beforehand. Again, I think this is probably something that we could put into board rule, though we could also put it in the statute. It doesn't, at the end of the day, it doesn't hit on a bigger issue, which is some of those students getting retained before 3rd grade and then being retained in 3rd grade. This would be specific to 3rd grade reading retention. Again, we could put it in the statute, but we don't necessarily feel it has to be in there. And then the last one was the early literacy funds and redirecting those to areas of need. I didn't include that in this draft, partially because I didn't really know how to accomplish that, and I think it needed more discussion. So I think I kind of just left it open-ended. So with that, I am going to stop talking and am happy to open it up to any questions, and with the caveat that I have to leave in about 5 minutes, and then Alicia's going to have to answer all those questions. So, as I mentioned before, this is the first go at the draft. We don't have to wordsmith it in a public meeting. If you have recommendations, then we could always exchange some emails. I can try to incorporate those, and then we can bring them back at the August meeting. I don't know if that fits with the timeline, but I know that there's an impulse to wordsmith things. But if there's big ticket things that you want to bring up now, I think that would be appropriate.
Thank you, Catcher. I am going to ask Dr. Cruz to be my eyes and ears and actually facilitate the feedback and questions. Thanks, Heather.
Okay, I had my hand raised, so I'll call on myself. Just a couple things. Catcher, thank you for doing this. It really, I think it looks very good. So just a couple things to bring forward. On the 3rd grade assessment that is not called out because it's not legislative, but just something to bring forward as we try to work together towards that big overarching system. Some things to think about as we move forward together with the department and we write that RFP. We want to make sure we look at that and not forget that as we look at that towards, as we craft that vision of new state assessment, moving forward, we really have that opportunity. Let's not forget that. That's a huge opportunity. So that needs to be called out separately, I think, in the RFP.
Yeah, and Dr. Cruz brings up a good point. Some of you may be aware the board put out a 5-year assessment plan. That was put together in response to some of the federal response about what we were doing with our statewide assessment and the menu of assessments. And there were some concerns brought up, well, what's happened? The ad hoc committee recommendations aren't in there for some of the assessment systems. And that's fair. That was really targeted to essentially our ELA and math assessments, statewide assessments in elementary and high school. But it brought up a good point that we're going to start working on essentially building out that assessment plan so it includes, what we're doing currently and what we want to do with the early literacy system, but also, our science assessments, our alternate assessments, the civics, all of that kind of good stuff. So that will be built out more, and that'll help keep a check on us when we're developing the new statewide assessment.
For sure. As well as we work forward with this policy, we want to make sure to work together with the ADE policy team, and so that we're speaking the same language, lobbying for the same things, talking the same language with our policymakers so that we're all very transparent about this so that we don't catch anybody off guard and that we're building trust along the way with people.
Thumbs up. Oh, yeah, sorry. We have folks on the phone. That was me. I was giving a thumbs up to what Dr. Cruz said.
You can't see your thumb either, Catcher.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Anybody else? Vince?
So there are lots of different ways to do this, and I appreciate not wordsmithing here, so I'm just going to throw 3 things out real fast. One is I think that you may want to specify that the statewide assessment would be adopted by the State Board of Education. I think the way it's worded here is probably a little bit unique, but I think you want to, it's implicit that it's adopted by the board, but it's not really specific, and you just don't want to, I think, have that conversation if not necessary. Second comment, and this is really just sort of a question, is whether or not a timeline is necessary. So based on the timelines for the board, to, work with the department, develop the RFP, get it out, adopt the assessment, whether or not you're going to have time for the next school year or whether or not there's going to be a gap based on what the school districts need to do to onboard the assessment and the charters. And then the last is really just an acknowledgement, Catcher, of what you said around cost. Moving from just a screener to a comprehensive assessment system in this realm, there are going to be costs associated with that. We're going to hear about it from our friends. I think it's good to be proactive on that front. So those are my 3 comments. So thank you.
Dr. Cruz, I'm just going to go through Dr. Cruz, Chairwoman Clark. Dr. Cruz, to Member Yanez's point, when we were first discussing the timeline, we thought it would be a good starting point to speak of the 5-year assessment plan, knowing that we're going to do a lot of changes for the 21-22 school year. When you look on the agenda for later this morning, we talk about the draft statutory changes, knowing that these changes could potentially be in next legislative session, then they're going into effect in the fall of 20. To Member Yanez's point, you don't want to have something that's implemented in the 2021 school year. So I do think that we should, as the committee, look at when we think this should be implemented, or do you want a pilot program for a couple of years and then full implementation? We can be a little bit more creative in our conversations at the committee while we're drafting the statute and Catcher starts talking to individuals at the legislature.
I would, Dr. Cruz and members, this will be the last thing and then I have to run out, but I would also concur with Member Yanez and advise that the timelines would be codified in any draft we put forward. Unless, of course, we think it could happen that next school year, in which case we'd be fine, but I would guess that would not be the case.
Right.
And Madam Co-Chair, I don't know what to call you. Yeah, I think, the general effective date is going to put you in, let's just say August, so you're already starting that school year.
Right. So, if I just swag it, you could probably implement the same time you implement the new assessment. So probably 21, 22. Because that's going to take time. Thank you, Deputy Director Baden.
Thank you. And Alicia does a great job at all the legislative stuff, so she'll be able to answer all your questions.
That's very kind of him. Any other comments or?
I do have a question.
And then Ms. Hart.
All right, so on page 1, section C, this is something new about each school district and charter school shall ensure that at least one kindergarten through 3rd grade teacher in each school has received training related to dyslexia that complies with the requirements prescribed in section 15-19. So my questions are, what is that training? Has that been defined?
Okay.
Who's providing the training? And why only one teacher?
So I can address that a little bit. So that is the new legislation that just came out of session from Senator Boyer. And it does not go into effect until, not this school year, but following school year. So we are working on, Sean Ross here is with us today, we are working on kind of phasing that training in. So we will be offering some training this year, like Dyslexia 101 for teachers to try to get everybody up to speed. This is kind of what they negotiated, one teacher. We thought that was kind of ridiculous. If you're going to train somebody, you ought to train everyone. But, it's an unfunded mandate. They're not funding any of it. Okay. So the fact that it doesn't go into effect for one more year gives us time to come back and maybe make a little more sense of it. There is a committee that will form this summer, a study committee to help us, get our arms around it with policymakers and some experts in the field. So we're hoping to do that through the summer and into the fall. But we will be putting together some training, and we will be charged with implementing that training.
And Chairwoman Clark, Dr. McMillan, to further Dr. Cruz's point, Mr. Ross from the department will be presenting on this at the August
Yep.
K-3 literacy ad hoc meeting.
Yeah, we do have a plan. We've been working on this all through the session. We did work with Senator Boyer and stakeholders and the policy team on this throughout the session. Mr. Ross is on it.
I do have a comment. I agree that this is generally looking really solid. My thought is, how do we bring the field along and invest them in these changes so that they're on board and supportive as the policy move forward, both to support the policy, but also then once it's implemented to actually be able to carry it out. So that might be a conversation we have in the future, but just wanted to flag it that there might be some things we could do to help bring people along in that process.
That's an excellent suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, these could be pretty big changes.
Yes,
So we don't want to catch people off guard.
agreed.
Chairwoman Clark, Ms. Member Hart, just a little background. So with board staff, like what we do on the day-to-day basis, right? So this committee would have this discussion. We also have these discussions when we meet with superintendents through GuppiMac. I hold quarterly superintendent meetings in our offices. We meet with ASA, GuppiMac's curriculum meeting. We talk a lot. And so that's kind of how we start to build the momentum. And then also utilizing organizations like Expect More and Helios and pushing out that information, but then also being available for feedback. And we will hit that even harder come the fall. So.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Ross, you can talk.
Chairperson Clark, members of the committee, just one thing to be made aware of. In the recommendations, there's a call for a universal kindergarten screener, and then a statewide universal kindergarten literacy screener, and then a statewide benchmark literacy for K-2. Most companies, most vendor products have both a screener and benchmark with them. So even though they are separated, just kind of keep in mind that the reality of that will probably be a single vendor that has both. Or, I mean, it could, I guess it doesn't have to be a single vendor, but just to be aware of that reality. So Dibbles is the most commonly used screener in Arizona. Dibbles also has a benchmark component. The same thing with Galileo, which is the second most commonly used, NWEA MAP, which is the third, and Star Renaissance, which is the fourth.
That is not to say we would choose any of those vendors.
Yes, thank you. Just citing data. Thank you, Dr. Cruz.
Phone. Ask if they have any questions on the phone.
Are there any questions from anybody on the phone? Hearing none, we can move on.
Chair Clark, can we move on to item 2? Okay.
Yes, sorry, I had to take myself off mute. We are moving from item 2 to item 3. Does the timeline?
Yes, the timeline. Thank you. Okay. So Chairwoman Clark, members of the committee, you all saw this timeline at our last K-3 literacy ad hoc. And when we're looking at the statutory and rule proposals timeline, if I can zoom it. Too much. Still too much. Okay. So we are, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to pass them out.
Yeah. Oh. We're so prepared. I'll never bring my own copies.
Oh, that's much better than the little paper. I do have one.
Oh yeah, I have it. Mine's smaller.
So it is easier to look at the second page. So the idea is this draft language would be presented to the board at their August retreat. And their August retreat is the 9th and 10th. From this meeting here today, we will be able to take what your feedback was, as well as the draft, and have just a conversation with the board at the retreat to really kind of gather what their thoughts are on the draft language, and also if they're still on board with the recommendations that they voted on in December. We should receive some feedback from the board, at which point board staff will share the board's feedback with this committee at the August ad hoc meeting. From there, we may update the draft again, bring it back to the board in August. If you notice that we would like the board to approve a statutory language change at the September board meeting. If for some reason we need to push it to October, I think that would be fine. I think we kind of built in a little bit of flex time in there. But the reason for approving a draft statute change with the board is because behind the scenes board staff has to work to try to get that on the calendar. And although Kesher told me I'm really good at legislative stuff, I have no idea what the terminology is. So we have to get a sponsor, and we have to get it assigned, a folder, I think it's called, so that we can move ahead in legislative session 20. Okay? And really your homework from last meeting to this meeting is just to look at the timeline and to determine if you had any concerns, if you thought it was like too aggressive, not aggressive enough, if there was anything we were forgetting.
Dr. Cruz, will you, is there any, you'll be my eyes and ears?
I will. Chairperson Clark, I don't see any questions at the moment in time. I actually think that, go ahead, Terry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I'm good.
My only question, or I guess comment, would be, especially that critical conversation at the board retreat. I'd love, Alicia, to work thoughtfully with you about how we ensure we are able to answer any questions they may have, or set the table on the context and the discussion. Because I know that's a critical piece for them to understand fully the recommendations and continue their support, or if they have other questions or concerns, we want to be able to answer them and bring it back to the group to think through.
Chairwoman Clark, members of the committee, are there any other questions on this statutory timeline?
One question, and this is a new person, stupid question.
There are no stupid questions.
What is the substance or the nature of the rule package that's talked about into 2020 here?
So Chairwoman Clark, Member Yanez, the rule package would be based upon any of the statutory changes that happens in the statute that the board would then have to create rules on. So the idea is statute would be changing. We would not just staff-wise make rule changes without the input of this committee to those rules. So it's, as you know, we're getting more in detail of the statute. And we felt that it would be important to have that in our timeline because we didn't want to forget about it. Because it is important, especially if you're going to be implementing law in the fall. So,
thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Chairperson Clark, I'm not hearing any more, any issues here or any other questions.
Okay, are we ready to move on to the next item?
We are.
And that next item is the
Chairwoman Clark, that item is the Cutscore Timeline.
Okay, sorry. I thought we were already on 4, so sorry.
No worries.
Timeline for raising third grade cut scores for the year 2021-2022.
So Chairwoman Clark, members of the committee, as you are aware, one of the recommendations was to raise the cut scores, but we're sitting in a very unique position where the State Board of Education has adopted their 5-year assessment plan, and they'll be looking to change the statewide assessment for grades 3-8 in the 21-22 school year. So when we reflect back on when AZ Merit was approved by the board and administered, in statute, AZ Merit cut score for third grade was the same as Ames was way back when. The State Board of Education approved the AZ Merit contract in the fall of 2014 for implementation and assessing of students in the spring of 2015. So it didn't allow for a lot of study. It didn't allow for any field testing. So we wanted to do something a little better this go around. So what we're proposing in this timeline, which we have sort of touched on it in this committee, is that we'll utilize that field testing year of 2021 with whatever assessment the state board chooses for the new statewide assessment. We'll utilize that field testing to really figure out what type of data we have within the state prior to setting that cut score. We want to ensure that we set it high enough to really drive instruction and drive intervention strategies and decisions. However, we do want to make note that it is really difficult to set a cut score, and it is there's no perfect solution. And so when you look at other states, we've been doing the research. Everyone kind of assumes to set it at 20%, and then after you get all of your kiddos within the exemptions out, you should sit somewhere between 7 and 10%. As you know, Arizona, we have one of the lowest cut scores, so we retain less than 1% per year. But with that conversation goes, with the raising of the cut score conversation, we need to have conversations around retention, and we need to have conversations on, what's next or what the impact is. So we're proposing to study all that within the next 2 years and then really look at that data from the field testing year to determine where the cut score should be placed.
Question. So has there been discussion over time of, as we're studying this, to look at a plan to raise cut scores over time rather than just like plop, now you're like from here to here, all in one swoop?
Mm-hmm. So Chairwoman Clark, Dr. Cruz, that conversation has occurred in at the ECS
Right.
conference. They came in in conjunction with Helios, and the governor's office. ECS came and they spoke to, even some of the members on this committee were present. I don't think it accurately reflects in this timeline that this committee also should discuss what to do with raising cut scores over a set amount of time to meet the goals that the state board has set through the progress meter. I think the board should have a discussion about that first before this committee gets into the nitty-gritty details, because unfortunately I just don't know where the board members are at on that.
Right.
And I would hate for this committee to do all that hard work and really having those conversations and then the board's going in a different direction. When we look at, I'm not going to blast out state names, but I know of one state that substantially raised cut scores very quickly over a couple of years, and there was extreme backlash. And so as staffers, we're taking the opportunity to learn from those mistakes so that we're not doing that in Arizona as well. So I hope that answers your question, Dr. Gores.
Right. So I hope we're going to do as we look at this timeline and we look at process, we're going to review all of those lessons learned from other states and look at lessons learned from people who have gotten really good results, people who did not get such good results. Are you going to have that discussion with the board at the board retreat?
Chairwoman Clark, Dr. Cruz, that's part of the discussion, right?
Okay.
Because we want to talk about Cutscores, we want to talk about statute changes, we want to talk about retention. We're going to touch on it at the retreat. I've instructed board staff through Jessica, who's our data and research analyst, to bring some of her workings and findings that she's been working so diligently on the past 6 months to the August K-3 ad hoc meeting. So she can really kind of deep dive some of those states and what she's learned from like Mississippi, Ohio, Indiana,
North Carolina.
Florida, a couple other states.
Yeah.
And as other states' legislative sessions are coming to a close, we are seeing some changes in landscapes across the United States. So we want to ensure that we have accurate information for the committee as well, up to date.
Super. Thank you. Other questions? Mr. Yanis?
Just a thought, and this is probably a question maybe to some of the practitioners, school district folks. As we get closer to 21, 22, when the cut score would be raised, what's the appropriate notice to the schools so that they can sort of recalibrate their sort of intervention systems and things to make sure that the students that require that most intensive intervention are going to receive that before that school year? So I think there's two parts to my question. One is getting to when the cut score is actually set so that schools have time. Mm-hmm. And the second maybe part of the question is, because it could be totally off target, whether or not schools are going to use that cut score to sort of calibrate their interventions anyway.
I think that's completely appropriate, as well as notice to parents.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Hope you're getting all that down, Ms. Alicia. Yes, so I think that's valid.
Dr. Cruz, members of the subcommittee, just one piece of advice. I would take a really good look at Mississippi. They recently raised their cut scores over the course of a few years, and decisions were made in a similar fashion as they're being made here, but they actually made it a huge movement within the schools and parent communities. They did this big social media movement. They had shirts made. I mean, it was really impressive, and they got just complete buy-in that the entire point of this process was not to arbitrarily raise a cut score to have more students retain, but in fact to raise the bar for all students in Mississippi. So it was really well done, and Dr. Kimyana Burke from Mississippi would be a great resource.
It'd be fantastic to do all of this in tandem with the work that we would do with all the legislative change, with maybe the comprehensive system, the change in cut score. We could brand all of that. You know, you can see a huge campaign coming forth, and we could really all, common language across our state, really everybody moving towards the goal. I mean, when you talk about it like that sounds exciting.
Yeah.
Member Cruz, can I just say a couple points?
Absolutely.
So I agree with a lot of the comments that have already been said, and I think it may be helpful and Member Yanis, to your point about really making sure that schools understand that we're these recommendations, that any raising of the cut score is in pursuit of and in support of making sure that students get interventions. It's not about retaining for retainment's sake. And maybe we need to begin to start thinking about and talking about raising cut scores as about getting more interventions where they're needed as early as they're needed. And retention is just one tool and not the only tool and not the only mechanism. And I do feel the only thing after listening to comments and looking through the changes so far, the statutory changes, is one, the spirit of a lot of the recommendations from the ad hoc so far were all about making sure that the system is built to get interventions as early as possible. And I don't know how, Alicia and all, we ensure that gets captured, but it does feel a little still we're in compliance mode rather than really building the system that will get us to the pursuit of what's going to drive better outcomes for students. So that's just a thought and just a comment, but we kind of are still not, we're still talking about retention as like as a set tool that is sort of the largest tool in our arsenal, and I don't actually think, I think some of these recommendations will help us to get interventions earlier to the kids that need them, so that so raising of the cut scores becomes not only about retention, but interventions when necessary. Hope that made sense. Sorry, it's a little earlier here than there. So.
I think that's a really good point, Ms. Clark. I think that's so important. Even when we're talking to our policymakers, really branding it as getting kids what they need and the help they need, supports they need, earlier and more often. Dr.
Thank you. That was
McMillan?
a lot more eloquent than me.
Absolutely.
So if I may, Chairman Clark and Dr. Cruz and members, so I know that we're talking about raising the cut scores and providing more interventions, but we are not really talking about how do you provide those interventions, because I will tell you as a school district person, we're constantly looking at our kids, and we're not waiting till they fail in third grade. We're looking earlier, but, you know, I hate to keep dragging money out in this conversation, but you know, you have very limited resources to provide all of these interventions, and my district uses DIBELS. We look at DIBELS. We're constantly looking at data. So I think we might be just losing a little bit of sight of the fact that most schools, charters or districts, we're not waiting for third grade for them to fail. We're looking really early, and if we're raising those cut scores, how are we providing these interventions when money is tight in all districts and charters? And I don't know, it just seems like if we're raising cut scores and saying we're going to retain kids, what are we doing to help the schools ensure that they have the resources to provide those interventions that kids need, even before third grade? And I know we have a little bit of extra money through Move On When Reading, but we continue to hate to ask for money, but it's an expensive thing that we're asking schools and charters to do. So that's my thought on that.
Absolutely. Ms. Fickman.
Thank you. I totally agree with Member McMillan was just saying. At the school level, it's the interventions and what we're doing right now. There's so much going on, and we do look at the data, and we're doing everything with the resources that we have with fidelity. And I think a lot of it is maybe it's the fidelity part of it is maybe something we need to look at, and with our trainings and professional developments, and maybe that's another area we can look at, because financially we do everything we can. We're working with the kids as soon as they get into kindergarten. We're doing the progress monitoring, and students are receiving interventions starting in kindergarten, going through the MTSS process and getting their interventions that they need, so that by the time they're in third grade, they should be able to pass if the interventions are working and for that student. So a lot of it is the funding. You only have so many resources. There's only so many teachers. There's only so many schools. Not all of them have reading specialists because they don't have the funds for it. So the classroom teachers needing to do it all. And so there's only so much time and so much money at this point to be able to get the kids where they need to be. And raising the cut score is kind of a daunting thing to think about at the school level, because it's like, what more can we do? Because we're using all our resources, we're using all our time to get them where we need to be. So that's kind of an area that I don't know how to improve on.
Right. And we haven't really discussed that area.
Yeah.
We're just talking about raising cut scores, but not how we're going to support
Support's
schools.
needed.
And, right. Their support system is not really there yet.
So Chairwoman Clark, members, I think my belief is that when you talk about raising the cut score and you look at this timeline, you're also looking at that comprehensive timeline as well, right? With the statute changes, and putting aside any additional monies, right? That is funneled into Move On When Reading, or funneled into the early literacy grants, or funneled into the department, right? Putting all that aside, right? If, let's just pretend, if the statute was to go through and there was a statewide, state board approved, comprehensive early benchmarking system that's also tied to universal screeners, right? Which makes me a little nervous. Like, you know, I have to be a realist in politics in Arizona, and like, we're very local control state. So something that is similar to everyone, I don't know. But maybe there's I don't want to use this word, but maybe there's a menu of options, right? But if the state pays for it, and the funding stays the same amount for those school districts, right? There's one way where we can take some of that money that the school district spends on their benchmarks, right? I know I just asked Sean really quick how much one very common benchmarking system costs, and it's $14 a kid in kinder through third, right? So if you're a large district, it could be a lot of money. If you're a small district, maybe not. But there's ways that we can have that conversation and say, it may not be the best scenario, but it could be a scenario. It could be, you know, something that's not the best, but we can go with it. And so it's really understanding what type of responsibility the state wants to have for funding some of those more comprehensive systems, and how much that would cost, right? If we're looking at 3 different vendors, or 2 vendors, or 1 vendor, you're going to have cost savings when you have more students within that vendor, right? And I think that is a conversation that we need to have, and I think it is a conversation that needs to continue to occur while we go through not only the statute changes, but when we also look at raising the cut scores of what type of supports are we going to provide to the schools so that they can do early interventions, hire a reading interventionist, hire additional teachers, hire paraprofessionals to help, right? We know that even our classified staff are very important in those early grades, because typically those are your staffers who are pulling the small groups and providing the direct one-on-one or 3-on-1 interventions. So it's a comprehensive look at reading. I lost my train of thought, but hopefully I answered that for you.
Well, and I'll just piggyback on that just a little bit, that if we look at this as a phased approach, this could be phase 1, and maybe phase 2 is, you know, we look at those other comprehensive supports that we've seen that are working in other states. Maybe phase 2 is that we put in place some other statewide training resources. So we've seen, for instance, we had some our statewide person from Mississippi come and speak to us, and she talked about the fact that we have reading specialists at the statewide level that we can go and kind of send out where they're needed across the state, and serve as coaches and mentors to go out to where they're absolutely in dire need, where they're not getting those results, and have robust training available for your teachers, for everywhere across the state, and set up training centers, you know, crosswise, so that we don't have to have everybody come into Maricopa. Maybe it's, you know, located all across the state, so they don't have to travel so far. So, you know, think of it as phases, and what do we want and what do we need? So let's start to vision that way. What do our teachers need? What do our kids need?
Can I build upon that? Given the conversation that and this actually relates to the next agenda item with ECS, but it seems like that conversation could really tee up what you're talking about, Heather. Mm-hmm. And, you know, my feedback from that event was it would be really great if we had a coordinated plan that both looked at policy funding, which we've been talking about here, but also instruction, right? And what are the instructional practices? What's the PD? How does it phase in? What's the timeline? And if we're all on the same page of what that looks like, it could be pretty powerful. So I hope that gets to the point that Cayenne you were raising, because I think if we have a coordinated approach, it will be more well received too. To show like the state's really invested in third grade reading. This is what we're going to do. Here's the plan. Let's all get on board. So I'm optimistic.
Can I just add to that?
Absolutely.
I think there's a lot of different conversations happening, and I do think that one of the things that will be helpful to get more coordinated around that. I think that I would say their read-on and all its collaborative partners have put together and almost actually 7 years into a state 10-year plan. So if that could be updated to include new plans that I know the department has and new visions that the state board has and other partners have. So maybe there's something to do there. I get a little worried about adding just like all these different offshoot plans that don't bring the whole vision together. So I think that's an interesting thought, Erin, and I'd love to help in thinking about the best way forward on that. And I think the conversation that Member Vickman, Member McMillan brought up, that is the real heart of the work, and I really hope this committee can lean in to identifying how best to support and set up LEAs for success in providing the interventions. Just being on the phone and not being able to read body language, I can tell there's some real concern and some angst around that, and that I think is our important work to how do we set our LEAs up so they feel empowered and supported to be able to do what works. I don't think we can just say we need more resources. We do have to say, and here's how we're going to better use those resources. So Alicia's point about how we provide some maybe state things that then take some of the resources pressure off of the LEAs is important. But we can't just keep talking about this in sort of a vacuum. So I really appreciate everyone's points and conversation, and it gets me excited about the work that this ad hoc committee can do to help lay the tracks for more success in this area and get everyone set on a common vision. So thank you.
That's good.
You need me?
I think Terry was bringing that to it.
Yeah. Okay. Chair Clark, would you like to move on to the item 5, presentation discussion on meeting with Education Commission of the States?
Yep, sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. So Chairwoman Clark, members of the committee, this item is on the agenda just because some committee members did attend ECS, and so I wanted the opportunity for the committee members to talk to each other about what they experienced at that meeting, if they had any aha moments, if they agreed, if they disagreed. I just have an opportunity to share out. I was in and out, so I unfortunately I'm not a good person, and Jessica was there the whole time. So Jessica has better notes than I do, so I had to be in and out that day. So does someone want to lead it off if you were in attendance or participated on a panel? Oh, Dr. Cruz.
I feel like you're looking at me. Okay.
Sure, go ahead.
I really thought it was a very interesting meeting, and it had a lot of interesting data. I thought the data that they presented in their presentation at the beginning was really, really interesting. I don't know if you have that available.
I don't. Not right now.
Okay. Just the data they brought forth on the payoff of having like universal preschool, how much that saves you in the long run, was fascinating. I don't know how they got that data or how they, what their metrics were, but we all kind of innately feel that and know that, but it was fascinating to see that up there on their slides, so that was good. And it was really great to have a lot of policymakers in the room the entire time. So a lot of them stayed the whole meeting, which was great.
Yeah, I'll add to that if I can. The value of having all those different people in the room was tremendous. At least in my experience, you don't often see all those parties coming together in one spot to talk about this issue. So that in and of itself it was just wonderful. I feel like we really laid a good foundation and used, like, it's building momentum, which is really positive around third grade reading. And I think there's lots of opportunity to continue building that momentum and to continue to invest all the people that were there in the conversation again. So we're like all coordinated and on the same page about next steps.
Right. Vince, did you have anything to add? I know you were there. I know Chairperson Clark was there.
Yeah, I thought the conversation was excellent, and the quality of the speakers was fantastic. I think one of the follow-ups I had, though, from what we heard, is that it was clear that the commission has a very good handle on other states that have done this, what their experience has been, what some of those learnings have been. And I don't know if that forum just wasn't the right time to necessarily get into that part of the conversation, but I think some follow-up with ECS on that specific issue would be really important for this committee to hear, because I think it goes to some of the questions that we were talking about earlier. You know, when we talk about, you know, the timeline that we're on, and the fact that some of the changes to the retention policy is sort of contingent upon the assessment changes. Well, there's a lot more to the system than just the assessment piece, which I think is the gist of what we were talking about, and timing is important. So it would be good to hear and maybe get some of that information from, if we can, from the commission, you know, for the committee to review, because I think it would be enlightening.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go.
Yeah, Deborah.
I was just thrilled to be there. I mean, to be able to be in a room full of the knowledge and the individuals that were there was just very enlightening for me, and I'm just thankful that I was invited, that we were to be a part of that. I did enjoy the whole presentation, all the speakers. When I think it was Bruce that spoke, I really keyed in on when he talked about the preschool through third grade, not just kindergarten through third, but he was talking a lot about the preschool through third grade, and the importance of the transitioning students from preschool into kindergarten to help them with their social and emotional problems that they have trying to become a kindergartner. So I felt it was a wonderful day, and I got a lot of information out of it, and I think that would be a great thing to continue or to have more discussions like that. So.
Chairperson Clark, anything?
Sure. I appreciated absolutely what everyone else has said about the folks that were in the room and the chance to have a conversation about what it would really take to improve outcomes for early literacy. I thought I appreciated the chance to talk about it sort of by topic around professional development, but also around social emotional learning. I do think that sometimes in our excitement and about trying to galvanize momentum, we lose sight of recognizing all the hard work that's been done. And I know it was probably really challenging for ADE to only have Heather up there to be able to talk about all the work, and she did a fabulous job. And Heather, I thought you were a brave soul in bringing up the issue about local control. And so I think we also need to recognize that it isn't just a lack of resources, but it is some of our sort of more invisible policies that are perhaps making it challenging, whether that's how we implement and work within and outside of the system around local control and things like that. So I thought that was really the first time I've seen a conversation be honest and real about some of the challenges. So I appreciated that. But I also think that it was a small group and not everyone was there at the table that would have contributed to the conversation. And I think that's an important part too, to connect all the dots and all the pieces and all the existing plans that need to be incorporated and partners that need to be involved. And I know that's certainly something that's always important to read on. So I'd want to make sure that we continue to try to have that filter.
Okay. All right. Chairwoman Clark, I think that's good for item number 5. Would you like to move on to item number 6?
Item number 6, which is the presentation and discussion on early literacy's role in the school improvement process.
Perfect. So Chairwoman Clark, members of the committee, this is a little bit selfish on my end because the State Board of Education is going to start having some conversations around the state school improvement statute and areas of change with school improvement. And as we know, when we talk about school improvement, and if you base school improvement off accountability letter grades, then you also need to have a conversation about early literacy, K-3, because that's kind of like your foundation of your school. I'm saying that terribly, but you get the drift. So I thought this committee could just have a conversation or take home as homework or some areas where you think we as the state board should be aware of when we're talking about school improvement. And although if you're K-8, maybe your school's letter grade is based on your 3-8 students, right? We should also look at early literacy when we're potentially putting that school into a school improvement model. So I have asked Mr. Ross to share some ways that his department already works with ADEs in ADE school improvement unit. But then I would like this committee to really just think above and beyond what's already being done, areas that we could improve with school improvement, perfect world kind of scenarios. And that would help me just get a grasp of early literacy and how it interacts with school improvement, so I can address some of the board members' concerns or whatnot come this potential change in statute for school improvement.
Chairperson Clark, members of the subcommittee. So the Move On When Reading team works in conjunction with our support and innovation team, our school improvement team, in areas particularly focused on identifying resources that are approved under the Every Student Succeeds Act evidence-based requirements. So our school improvement team, headed by the Deputy Associate Superintendent Devin Isherwood, they vet programming, they vet vendor products and professional development to make sure that they meet ESSA requirements. We do that as well, though in a bit of a smaller scope. We focus obviously on K-3 core reading programs, reading interventions, those kind of things. So we do speak about our respective processes for approving and how our lists may differ at times. So, for example, under Move On When Reading, we accept products under the rationale level, which is the lowest level of evidence under ESSA. That's because Move On When Reading is not about the proactive use of funding the way that school improvement is. They can say to a school, hey, you can't use funding for next year for this product because it's rationale. For Move On When Reading, that would require us calling a district and saying, hey, you're using a core reading program that's at rationale. Somehow come up with $5 million next year and get a new one. So we made some decisions that are a little bit different, but we are in communication about that. Historically, this K-12 standards team, so I'm also the English Language Arts Director, we have helped provide professional development to schools and school improvement that are in the Elevate program. That has not been as frequent as the K-12 standards team has shrunk repeatedly. I am currently the only ELA person in our K-12 standards, and it's actually only 10% of me, so it's like this part. And so just given capacity and funding, there's only so much that we can participate in that. When our support and innovation team is dealing with a school and they're having issues with K-3 literacy, they do reach out to us for some guidance, but that's about the extent of it at the moment. And primarily, there obviously is a great desire to be collaborating in a more meaningful way, but it's at the end of the day right now, it's staffing and capacity that's preventing that from happening.
So really the question is, would you like this as homework or would you like to discuss it now? The homework you can just turn into me.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I've seen different iterations of the school improvement process over the years, and even in the best of times, capacity was always a huge challenge, especially when you're talking about the number of schools that are in typically the lowest two what do you call them?
Tiers,
Two
DNF.
tiers, yeah. Right now, DNF. So I guess what I'm trying to be helpful to the conversation the board's going to have. So what is the board thinking in terms of the school improvement conversation? I think early literacy for an elementary school obviously needs to be looked at in that. But what is the board sort of looking at?
So Chairwoman Clark, Member Yanes, good question. The board's looking at it at the August retreat. So I can give you a little bit of what occurred last session. Last session, there was a bill ran that created a school turnaround type of school improvement where the easiest way I can compare it is kind of like financial receivership, right? So if you're, there's a whole bunch of stipulations, DNF school, you would be put into almost like an academic receivership where the state board would have oversight. Well, when we ran the numbers with that statute, it was a lot of schools. And for the state board staff, because that's how it was written, was the state board would be overseeing it. It would be part with the department, but it was mostly with the state board staff. We did not have the bodies to be able to do a receivership type program for accountability. There was also some parts within that bill that allowed different agencies and organizations to come in and kind of take over that school within that school district, right? So we as staff understand what the original sponsor and writer of that bill last session was, where they were looking to go. We also understand the historical context of solution teams. It's called solution teams. Yep, had a moment for a second. Solution teams. We understand where we were with solution teams. We understand where we currently are with solution teams, and we understand that funding piece that's lacking within the state. And from my conversations with a lot of superintendents and administrators who have gone through that process, that was 10 years ago, some pitfalls and some successes of that program as well. So we as a state board, I'm trying to bring in WestEd. There's actually a content center that is paid for by the federal government, and that content center's funding goes away September 30th, and that content center just deals with school improvement. So I'm trying to utilize WestEd and their content center to provide some best practices, some pitfalls to the state board at the August retreat. And that's really where the first conversation is going to be, right? And frankly, I'm not an expert in this area as a practitioner. I'm still learning in this area, and I'm doing a lot of research myself. From there, the state board will be able to ask follow-up questions, and I plan on bringing in the WestEd Content Center at least 2 more times prior to their funding dissipating. Really what I need help with is understanding, I'm understanding the comprehensive system for early literacy. I know that there are certain aspects of early literacy that we need to have in a statewide comprehensive plan to ensure that we're getting the outcomes that we want. My question is, if we have that perfect world and the school is still not succeeding, what do you as the experts in early literacy think need to happen in order to fix it?
So can I weigh in?
Sure.
And I know you want to get feedback from all of us, but however, given the fact that we're only 5 members and present, 4 on the phone, and several not present, would it be advantageous for you to maybe pose that question via email to folks as homework? Just thinking aloud. So that you get robust feedback from every single one of our members. I'm just thinking aloud, just as opposed to just a few of us having dialogue, because we haven't heard from everybody on the phone, not everybody's here, and it just sets sets the stage for everybody to be able to have that dialogue moving forward, rather than just a few of us weighing in for you today.
Member Clark Deckers, I'm fine with that. I just don't want to. I want to be able to have this committee's ideas in front of me when I go and I sit and learn from West Ed and I go and try to direct a retreat for the state board.
So Chairwoman Clark, is that okay with you?
It's fine with me. I think that would be very helpful. And Alicia, first of all, I appreciate you posing this question and asking and using the ad hoc in this way. I think that's really important. And I do think by email, our members can give some thoughts. And I would just pose the question very clearly so that you don't get they get you the feedback that you need. And for instance, two things come to mind for me that I would try to put down in my notes to you. One is, Sean, we used to work with the Move On When Reading Committee and included school improvement, and I thought what conversations about what they're looking for and guidance and feedback from the literacy team about what they could be looking for as they're doing their school improvement process was really valuable. So maybe trying to capture that for them. And then as well as our example of our first case study was a school that was in school turnaround and really developed and built an early literacy system. So what other schools that have been successful through the school turnaround might you learn some of the things they did specific around early literacy? So I can think of a few other examples that I include in my notes. But I think it's important to also spend time looking at what has worked and why did that work, or specific around school turnaround and the connection to early literacy.
So just being really clear with your question, Alicia, and maybe it's even more than one question for us.
Chairwoman Clark, Dr. Cruz, yes.
Thank you.
I also haven't finished my coffee, so I'm not really clear speaking yet today. So, okay, well, if there's anything else in item 6, we can move on to item 7. This is not a future meeting date, but we do have Vince Yanes, who is now on this K-3 ad hoc.
Yes, welcome and happy to have him here with us.
We are very happy to have him. Vince, do you want to share a little bit about your background, or not, or
real briefly. I've spent my career in really the K-12 world. I worked for the State Board of Education for a long time. I think held every position you can hold for the State Board over my 16 years there. And since that time with the State Board, I have worked in the philanthropic sector, focusing on education issues. A couple years with Arizona Community Foundation, heading up all of their education and public policy work. And now I'm Senior Vice President for Arizona Community Engagement at Helios Education Foundation, where I head up all of our work in Arizona. And it's great because I get to work with a lot of the same people that I got to work with when I was working for the state. Still get to work with school district and charter folks and the business community to try to bring about some positive change in education in Arizona. So I'm very happy to be here. I was actually in this building yesterday for the first time in a very long time. So this is my second meeting in a number of years in this building. So I'm happy to be back engaged in this way. So thanks.
Roles vary greatly by state, but it does allow us to sit down and say, hey, has your board done this? What are the steps you have taken? What are the pitfalls I should avoid? So hopefully I'll bring back some really good information for this committee. Like I stated earlier, we will have some research from Jessica to present to this committee, and we should have some feedback from the state board on any draft language. So, and with that, Chairwoman Clark, I think we're good on this item.
All right, then. Awesome. Thank you, everybody. And I appreciate everybody else who was able to be here on the phone. And we are officially adjourned.
Thank you.
It's a wrap.